The Texas heat shimmered across the endless prairie, creating mirages that danced on the horizon like phantoms from another world. It was late summer of 1889, and the drought had been merciless, turning the grass brown and cracking the earth into patterns that resembled broken pottery. Into this harsh landscape walked a child who seemed to have materialized from the heat waves themselves, a boy of perhaps 8 years old, carrying nothing but a small cloth bundle and wearing clothes that had once been good quality, but were now faded and torn from hard travel. Jonas McAllister first spotted the boy from his front porch, where he'd been sitting with his evening coffee and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red. At 64, Jonas was a man who had learned to notice everything and trust nothing, traits that kept him alive through the Civil War and 40 years of frontier life. The sight of a lone child walking across his property with no adult supervision was unusual enough to command his full attention. The boy moved with purpose despite his obvious exhaustion, his small frame struggling against the weight of whatever was in his bundle. As he drew closer, Jonas could see that his face was streaked with dust and tears, and his dark eyes held a kind of hollow emptiness that came from witnessing things no child should ever see. His clothes, though dirty and worn, showed evidence of careful mending and the kind of attention that spoke of a loving family, or at least someone who had cared for him before circumstances had forced him onto the road alone. Jonas descended from his porch slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He had dealt with enough scared animals, both human and otherwise, to understand that sudden gestures could trigger panic or flight. The boy stopped about 20 feet away, his body tensed as if ready to run at the first sign of threat. But his eyes met Jonas's with a directness that suggested intelligence and determination beyond his years. "Easy there, son," Jonas said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle authority he'd once used to calm spooked horses. "You look like you've been traveling a long way." The boy nodded but didn't speak, his grip tightening on his bundle, as if it contained everything precious left in his world. Jonas could see that the child was exhausted, dehydrated, and probably hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Whatever had driven him to this isolated ranch, it had been serious enough to push him beyond the normal limits of childhood endurance. "You hungry?" Jonas asked, already knowing the answer from the boy's gaunt appearance. "I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread from this morning. Nothing fancy, but it's filling." The offer food seemed to crack the child's defensive composure slightly, and Jonas saw him swallow hard as his body betrayed the desperate hunger he'd been trying to hide. But still he didn't speak, as if words themselves had become dangerous things that couldn't be trusted to strangers. Jonas had seen that kind of silence before, in soldiers who had survived battles too terrible to describe, and in civilians who had witnessed atrocities that had stolen their ability to trust in human goodness. It was the silence of someone who had learned that speaking the truth could be deadly, and that survival sometimes depended on keeping secrets locked away where they couldn't be used as weapons. "Tell you what," Jonas said, settling onto the porch steps to make himself less imposing. "Why don't you come up to the house and have something to eat? No questions, no demands. Just food and a place to rest for someone who looks like they need both." The boy's resolve finally crumbled at the offer of unconditional kindness. He walked slowly toward the house, his small feet shuffling through the dust, and when he reached the porch steps, he simply collapsed as if his legs could no longer support the weight of whatever burden he had been carrying. Jonas carried the unconscious boy into his house, noting how light he was. Too light for a child his age, evidence of weeks or perhaps months of inadequate nutrition. The interior of the ranch house reflected its owner's personality. Clean, functional, and spare, with few decorations but everything in its proper place. Jonas laid the boy on the parlor sofa and began the careful process of assessment and care that he'd learned during his years as a cavalry medic. The child was severely dehydrated and malnourished, but there were no obvious injuries beyond the normal cuts and bruises that came from traveling rough country on foot. His clothes, when examined more closely, told a story of careful preparation for a journey that had lasted far longer than anticipated. Someone had packed extra socks, a small sewing kit, and even a few pieces of hardtack that had been carefully wrapped to prevent spoilage. This wasn't a runaway or abandoned child, but someone who had been sent away deliberately by people who cared about his welfare. When the boy finally woke, it was with the instant alertness of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly. His eyes swept the unfamiliar room before settling on Jonas, who was sitting nearby with a bowl of warm broth and a patient expression. "Easy, son," Jonas said softly. "You're safe here. You collapsed on my porch, so I brought you inside to make sure you were all right." The boy accepted the broth with trembling hands, drinking slowly but steadily as his body absorbed the first nourishment it had received in days. Jonas watched him carefully, noting the way he held the bowl protectively and the manner in which his eyes constantly checked the exits as if planning escape routes. This was a child who had been taught to be afraid, probably with good reason. "Got a name?" Jonas asked when the boy had finished eating. For a moment, it seemed like the child might not answer, but then he whispered, "Samuel." "Samuel Yazzie." The surname was Native American, but the boy's features were mixed, probably the result of a union between a white father and an Indian mother, or perhaps several generations of intermarriage that had blended bloodlines and cultures. In the current political climate of Texas, such heritage could be both blessing and curse, opening doors in some communities while closing them firmly in others. "Well, Samuel Yazzie," Jonas said formally, "I'm Jonas McAllister, and this is my ranch. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to, no questions asked." It was a promise that Jonas meant completely, though he had no idea of the consequences it would bring. Over the following days, Samuel began to recover his strength, but his silence persisted. He helped with chores around the ranch, demonstrating a knowledge of animals and farm work that suggested rural upbringing, but he rarely spoke beyond basic necessities. Jonas respected the boy's need for silence, understanding that some wounds required time and trust to heal properly. Samuel's small bundle, when he finally opened it, contained a few precious possessions that told the story of his interrupted childhood: a hand-carved wooden horse, a photograph of a man and woman, who were probably his parents, and a letter written in Spanish that Samuel guarded jealously but never showed to Jonas. There was also a small amount of money, enough to suggest that his journey had been planned and funded by adults who wanted to ensure his survival, but not enough to support him indefinitely. Jonas found himself growing attached to the quiet boy who worked beside him during the day and sat on the porch in the evenings, staring at the stars as if searching for answers to questions he couldn't voice. The ranch, which had been silent for too many years, began to feel alive again with the presence of someone who needed protection and care. 3 weeks after Samuel's arrival, Jonas was awakened before dawn by the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders moving with the kind of coordination that suggested official business rather than casual travel. He dressed quickly and stepped onto his porch with his rifle, a precaution that had become automatic during his years of frontier living. The delegation that rode into his yard consisted of 5 men in suits and badges, led by a heavy-set individual who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to having his demands met without question. Jonas recognized the type immediately: territorial officials who wielded their power like a weapon and viewed resistance to their authority as personal affronts that required swift correction. "Mr. McAllister," the leader called out, remaining mounted in a display of assumed superiority. "I'm Deputy Marshal William Crenshaw, and we're here on official business regarding a minor child believed to be in your custody." Jonas felt his jaw tighten at the formal tone and the implicit threat contained in the marshal's words. "Deputy," he replied carefully, "what business would that be?" Crenshaw reached into his vest and withdrew a folded document that looked official enough to intimidate most civilians. "We have a court order for the removal of one Samuel Yazzie, age approximately 8 years, to be placed in the custody of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School for proper education and assimilation into civilized society." The words hit Jonas like physical blows, each phrase carefully chosen to sound reasonable while hiding the brutal reality of what they represented. The Carlisle School was notorious throughout the territory for its harsh treatment of Native American children, its systematic destruction of tribal culture and identity, and its high mortality rate among students who were forbidden to maintain any connection to their heritage or families. "The boy's not harming anyone here," Jonas said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of warning that the more experienced members of the delegation immediately recognized. "He's well cared for, well fed, and learning useful skills. I see no reason to disrupt his situation." Crenshaw's smile was cold and patronizing. "Mr. McAllister, I'm sure you mean well, but you're not qualified to provide the kind of education and moral guidance that a half-breed child requires." The Carlisle School has trained professionals who specialize in civilizing Indian children and preparing them for productive lives in white society. The casual racism in the marshal's words made Jonas's anger flare, but he kept his voice level through long practice at controlling his temper. And if I refuse to turn him over, then you'll be arrested for interfering with federal law enforcement and contributing to the delinquency of a minor, Crenshaw replied smoothly. The boy will be taken anyway, and you'll find yourself in federal prison for obstructing justice. It was a threat designed to intimidate and cow, backed by the assumption that isolated ranchers would always choose their own safety over the welfare of someone else's child. But Crenshaw had badly misjudged his opponent. Jonas McAllister had spent his entire adult life fighting for causes and principles that matter more to him than personal safety, and he wasn't about to start compromising his values now. "Well then, Deputy," Jonas said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet determination that experienced lawmen learn to recognize and respect, "I reckon we have ourselves a problem, because I'm not turning that boy over to anyone, court order or no court order." The refusal hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot, unmistakable in its implications and finality. Crenshaw's face darkened with anger and surprise. He clearly hadn't expected resistance from a lone rancher facing 5 armed officials. "You're making a serious mistake, McAllister," the marshal said, his hand moving toward his weapon. "This doesn't have to be difficult, but it will be if you insist on being stubborn." Jonas shifted his rifle slightly, the movement subtle but unmistakable in its meaning. "Samuel stays here, Deputy. That's final." The confrontation on Jonas's porch escalated as Deputy Marshal Crenshaw realized that his usual tactics of intimidation and legal threats were not working on the stubborn rancher. The other members of his delegation shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of violence, but unwilling to challenge their leader's authority. These were men accustomed to dealing with frightened civilians who capitulated at the first show of force, not experienced frontiersmen who had faced down worse threats than a handful of territorial officials. "Mr. McAllister," Crenshaw said, his voice taking on the hard edge that preceded violence, "you have exactly 1 minute to produce the boy and turn him over to federal custody. After that, we'll be forced to search your property and arrest you for obstruction of justice." Jonas remained motionless on his porch, his rifle held casually but ready for instant use. 40 years of frontier life had taught him to recognize bluffs, and everything about Crenshaw's bearing suggested a man who was more accustomed to bullying than fighting. "Deputy, you're welcome to try searching my property," Jonas replied calmly. "But I should warn you that I'm not in the habit of allowing armed strangers to ransack my home without proper warrants signed by legitimate judges." The challenge was delivered in a tone that was almost conversational, but its implications were clear to everyone present. Jonas was drawing a line in the sand, establishing boundaries that would be defended with lethal force if necessary. Crenshaw had badly underestimated his opponent, assuming that a lone rancher would be easily intimidated by official authority and superior numbers. "We have all the legal authority we need," Crenshaw blustered, though his voice lacked conviction it had carried earlier. "That court order gives us the right to search any property where the boy might be hiding." "Let me see it," Jonas said, extending his hand. "I want to read the exact wording of this court order and verify the signature of the judge who issued it." The request clearly made Crenshaw uncomfortable, confirming Jonas's growing suspicion that the document was either forged or obtained through fraudulent means. Legitimate federal officials would have no problem allowing their paperwork to be examined by the people affected, but corrupt ones often relied on the assumption that their targets would be too intimidated or ignorant to demand verification. "You're not qualified to evaluate legal documents," Crenshaw said dismissively. "Just accept that we have proper authority and cooperate with federal law enforcement." Jonas's smile was cold and dangerous. "Deputy, I may be just a rancher, but I can read well enough to spot a forgery or identify a corrupt official when I see one. Now, either show me that court order or get off my property." The demand hung in the air like a challenge to a duel, forcing Crenshaw to choose between backing down and escalating to violence. The marshal's hand moved toward his gun, but before he could complete the motion, a new voice cut through the tension. "Pa, is everything all right?" Samuel appeared in the doorway behind Jonas, his young face showing concern but no fear. The boy had obviously been listening to the confrontation, and his decision to show himself at this crucial moment demonstrated a kind of courage that impressed even the hardened territorial officials. The sight of the child they had come to collect seemed to galvanize Crenshaw's determination, reminding him of the substantial fees he would collect for delivering Samuel to the Carlisle school. "There's the boy," he said triumphantly. "Samuel Yazzie, by order of the territorial court. You're coming with us for transport to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School." Samuel looked up at Jonas with eyes that held complete trust and faith, clearly expecting the man who had given him sanctuary to continue protecting him. "Pa," he said quietly, using the title for the first time since his arrival. The single word carried more weight than any formal adoption papers could have conveyed, establishing a relationship that transcended blood ties and legal documents. Jonas felt something shift in his chest when Samuel called him Pa, a warmth and protectiveness that he hadn't experienced since losing his own family decades earlier. The boy's trust and faith in his protection awakened instincts that went deeper than law or self-preservation, tapping into the fundamental drive to shield one's children from harm regardless of the personal cost. "It's all right, son," Jonas said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite the odds against him. "Nobody's taking you anywhere you don't want to go." The promise was delivered with a kind of finality that left no room for negotiation or compromise. Jonas had made his choice, and everyone present understood that he would rather die than break his word to the child who had just claimed him as family. Crenshaw's face darkened with rage at this continued defiance of his authority. "McAllister, you're harboring a federal fugitive and interfering with the lawful duties of territorial officials. Stand aside and let us take the boy, or face the consequences of your actions." "The only fugitive I see," Jonas replied calmly, "is a frightened child who's found safety and family after whatever hell drove him to my door. And the only criminals here are the men who want to drag him away from that safety for 30 pieces of silver." The biblical reference was not lost on Crenshaw or his men, who understood that they were being compared to Judas Iscariot and found wanting. The moral weight of Jonas's accusation was particularly effective because it carried an element of truth that made them uncomfortable with their mission. The Carlisle school paid substantial bounties for Native American children, and everyone involved in the collection process received a share of those payments. "You're trying my patience, old man," Crenshaw snarled, his hand hovering over his gun. "This is your last chance to do this the easy way." Jonas stepped protectively in front of Samuel, his rifle now held in a position that could be brought to bear instantly if violence erupted. "Deputy, I've been in more fights than you've had hot meals, and I've never yet backed down from a man who threatened a child under my protection. You want the boy, you'll have to go through me to get him." The challenge was delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death many times and found it less frightening than dishonor. Crenshaw had encountered resistance before, but never from someone who radiated the kind of lethal competence that Jonas projected. This wasn't a frightened civilian or desperate outlaw, but a man who had survived 40 years of frontier violence through superior skill and unshakable resolve. Behind Jonas, Samuel stood straight and still, his young face showing none of the fear that might have been expected from a child facing such a threatening situation. Instead, his dark eyes held a kind of calm acceptance that suggested he had been preparing for this confrontation since his arrival at the ranch. The boy had learned early that life was a series of struggles between good and evil, and he had no doubt which side Jonas represented in this particular battle. "You can't protect him forever," Crenshaw said, trying a different approach. "We know where you live, and we have the resources of the territorial government behind us. Sooner or later, you'll have to sleep, and when you do, we'll be waiting." The threat was both crude and revealing, confirming Jonas's assessment that these men were more thugs than lawmen. Legitimate officials will rely on legal processes and proper procedures, not nighttime raids and vigilante tactics. "Maybe so," Jonas admitted, "but I won't be alone." The statement was delivered with such confidence that it made Crenshaw pause and reconsider his assumptions about the situation. There was something in Jonas's tone that suggested he knew something the marshal didn't, some factor that would change the equation in ways that hadn't been anticipated. What Crenshaw didn't understand was that Jonas McAllister had not lived alone on his remote ranch for 40 years without developing connections and alliances throughout the surrounding territory. Word of the confrontation had already begun to spread through networks of communication that the territorial officials had never bothered to understand or infiltrate. Texas in 1889 was still frontier country, where survival often depended on the mutual support of widely scattered neighbors who understood that today's helper might be tomorrow's refuge. The news traveled first to the Ramirez family, whose ranch bordered Jonas's property to the south. Miguel Ramirez had served with Jonas during the Civil War and had maintained their friendship through 4 decades of shared struggles and mutual assistance. When Miguel's youngest son rode breathlessly into their yard with news of armed officials threatening to take Samuel by force, the patriarch of the Ramirez clan made a decision that would echo through the territory for years to come. "Saddle the horses," Miguel told his 3 grown sons, "and send word to the others. Jonas McAllister stood with us when the Comanche raided our winter camp. Now we stand with him." The message spread with remarkable speed through a network of ranchers, small farmers, and working people who had learned to depend on each other in a land where official authority was often corrupt or simply absent when needed most. From the Ramirez Ranch, riders carried the news to the German settlement at New Braunfels, where families who had fled European oppression understood the importance of protecting children from government persecution. From there, the word reached the Irish railroad workers who had built the spur line to San Antonio, men who had their own bitter experiences with authorities who claimed to act in the name of civilization while serving only greed and prejudice. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always do. But the essential facts remained constant. A good man was protecting an innocent child from corrupt officials who wanted to profit from human misery. The details of Samuel's heritage, his mysterious arrival, and Jonas's steadfast refusal to surrender became part of a larger narrative about the struggle between individual conscience and institutional power. By sunset, more than 100 families throughout the territory had heard the story and made their own decisions about where they stood. The network of mutual support that had sustained frontier communities for generations was being activated in defense of a principle that transcended racial boundaries and political affiliations: the right of decent people to protect children from those who would harm them. Meanwhile, at the ranch, Crenshaw and his men had withdrawn to a safe distance to observe Jonas's property and plan their next move. The marshal was confident that the old rancher's resistance would crumble once he realized the futility of standing alone against federal authority. What Crenshaw failed to understand was that Jonas had never intended to stand alone, and that his confident defiance was based on knowledge of resources and alliances that went far beyond the isolated ranch where the confrontation had begun. As darkness approached, Jonas stood on his porch with Samuel beside him, both of them watching the horizon with the patient anticipation of people who knew the help was coming. The boy had stopped asking questions about the men who wanted to take him away, seeming to understand instinctively that his fate was now tied to forces larger than any individual's ability to control. "Pa!" Samuel said quietly, using the title that had already become natural to both of them. "What happens if they come back tonight?" Jonas put his hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the trust and vulnerability that made a protection a sacred duty rather than a simple choice. "Then we'll face whatever comes together, son. But I don't think we'll be facing it alone." As full darkness settled over the Texas prairie, Jonas and Samuel were not alone in their vigil. Throughout the territory, families were making preparations for what might become a defining moment in the ongoing struggle between individual conscience and institutional authority. The news of Crenshaw's ultimatum had reached communities that rarely agreed on anything, but who found common ground in their distrust of corrupt officials and their commitment to protecting children from government persecution. Miguel Ramirez and his 3 sons were the first to arrive, riding through the darkness with the confidence of men who knew the country intimately and had navigated its dangers for decades. Behind them came other members of their extended family, cousins, in-laws, and longtime friends who had answered the call for mutual assistance without question or hesitation. These were people who understood that survival in frontier country often depended on standing together against common threats. From the German settlement came the Muller family and their neighbors, solid farmers who had fled European oppression and had no intention of allowing American officials to repeat the same kinds of abuse they had witnessed in the old country. Their wagons carried not only men and weapons, but also women and children who understood that this was about more than one boy's fate. It was about the kind of society they wanted to build in their new homeland. The Irish railroad workers arrived in groups of 10 and 20, some still wearing the clothes they had worn during their shifts laying track across the harsh Texas landscape. These were men who had their own bitter experiences with authorities who claimed to serve law and order while actually serving only the interests of the wealthy and powerful. They brought with them a deep understanding of the importance of solidarity in the face of institutional oppression. As midnight approached, the hills surrounding Jonas's ranch began to come alive with the flicker of torches and the soft sounds of people taking positions in the darkness. The gathering was remarkable not only for its size, more than 300 people from dozens of different communities, but also for its diversity. Anglo ranchers stood beside Mexican vaqueros, German farmers worked alongside Irish laborers, and all of them were united in their determination to prevent the government from taking Samuel away from the man who had given him sanctuary. Jonas watched from his porch as the lights appeared one by one around his property, feeling a mixture of gratitude and amazement at the response his stand had generated. He had expected some support from his immediate neighbors, but the scope of the gathering suggested that his confrontation with Crenshaw had tapped into something much larger, a deep reservoir of resentment against the kind of corruption and abuse that the territorial government represented. Samuel stood beside him, his young eyes wide with wonder at the sight of so many people who had come to protect someone they had never met. "Who are they, Pa?" he asked quietly. "They're good people, son," Jonas replied, his voice thick with emotion. "People who understand that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible." The torches formed an almost perfect circle around the ranch, creating a perimeter that would be impossible for Crenshaw's men to breach without triggering a confrontation that none of them were prepared to handle. The message was clear and unmistakable. Samuel Yazzie was under protection of an entire community, and anyone who wanted to harm him would have to face the consequences of challenging that collective will. In his temporary camp a mile away, Deputy Marshal Crenshaw stared at the lights surrounding Jonas's ranch with growing alarm. What had started as a simple child recovery mission had somehow transformed into a major confrontation with hundreds of armed civilians who seemed prepared to resist federal authority with force if necessary. The marshal was beginning to understand that he had badly miscalculated both the local politics and the personal relationships that govern life in this part of Texas. Throughout the long night, the community of protectors maintained their positions around Jonas's ranch with the discipline and patience of people who understood that their presence alone might be enough to prevent violence. They had not come to wage war against federal authority, but to bear witness and ensure that any actions taken against Samuel would be observed and remembered by hundreds of people who could not be intimidated or silenced. The torches burned steadily in the darkness, creating a ring of light that could be seen for miles across the flat prairie. From his position on the porch, Jonas could make out individual figures moving quietly among the hills, but the overall effect was of a silent army that had materialized from the earth itself to stand guard over his small ranch. The sight was both humbling and inspiring, a reminder of the power that ordinary people could wield when they chose to stand together for a common cause. Samuel had fallen asleep on the porch swing, exhausted by the emotional stress of the day, but secure in the knowledge that he was protected by more people than he had ever imagined possible. Jonas covered the boy with a blanket and continued his own vigil, watching the lights and thinking about the chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. He had offered sanctuary to one frightened child, and in doing so had triggered a response that revealed the deep connections and shared values that held frontier communities together despite their surface differences. As dawn approached, the torches began to flicker and die, but the people who had carried them remained in their positions. In the growing light, Jonas could see them more clearly. Families with children, elderly couples who had probably ridden many miles to be here, young men who had left their work to stand with someone they had never met. They represented every ethnic group and social class in the territory, united by nothing more than their commitment to protecting an innocent child from corrupt authorities. The sight of so many people maintaining their silent vigil was deeply moving, but it was also strategically brilliant. Crenshaw and his men could not possibly arrest or intimidate such a large group, and any attempt to use force against them would create a public relations disaster that could reach all the way to Washington. The territorial government depended on at least the appearance of popular support, and images of federal officials attacking families who were protecting an orphan child would undermine that support in ways that could have far-reaching political consequences. At first light, a delegation of community leaders approached the ranch house, walking slowly and deliberately to demonstrate their peaceful intentions. At their head was Miguel Ramirez, but behind him came representatives from each of the major groups that had answered Jonas's call for help. They moved with the dignity of people who understood the historical importance of what they were doing, creating a moment that would be remembered and talked about for generations to come. "Jonas," Miguel said formally when they reached the porch, "we have come to offer our protection to you and the boy, and to bear witness to whatever happens here. We want everyone, including the territorial authorities, to understand that Samuel Yazzie is under protection of this entire community." The declaration was both simple and profound, establishing a precedent that would change the relationship between individual families and government authority throughout the territory. By claiming collective responsibility for Samuel's welfare, the assembled community was asserting a right that went beyond law or politics, the right of decent people to protect children from those who would harm them. Jonas felt tears forming in his eyes as he looked out at the sea of faces surrounding his ranch. These people had risked their own safety and security to stand with him in defense of a principle that mattered more than any individual's comfort or convenience. "I'm grateful beyond words," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Samuel and I both know that we're not alone, and that makes all the difference in the world." As the sun climbed higher into the Texas sky, the extraordinary gathering around Jonas's ranch began to take on the character of a peaceful festival rather than a confrontation. Children played among the adults, women shared food and stories, and men who had been strangers the night before found common ground in their shared commitment to protecting Samuel from those who would harm him. The transformation was remarkable, suggesting that the crisis had created bonds that would endure long after the immediate threat had passed. Deputy Marshal Crenshaw watched these developments with growing frustration and alarm. His mission to collect Samuel for transport to the Carlisle school was clearly impossible to complete in the face of such overwhelming community opposition. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that his authority as a territorial official meant nothing to people who had chosen to place their loyalty with principles rather than institutions. Any attempt to force the issue would result in a confrontation that could easily escalate into violence, with hundreds of potential casualties and political consequences that could reach all the way to the federal level. Faced with an impossible situation, Crenshaw made the decision that would save his career and reputation. He chose to retreat and report to his superiors that the child had disappeared and could not be located despite extensive search efforts. It was a lie. But it was a lie that would allow everyone involved to save face while protecting Samuel from a fate that awaited him at the Carlisle school. "Pack up," he told his men. "The boy's not here, and we're wasting time searching empty country." The retreat was conducted with as much dignity as possible, but everyone present understood what it represented. The victory of community solidarity over corrupt authority. The triumph of moral principle over institutional power. As Crenshaw's delegation rode away, a cheer went up from the assembled crowd. Not a celebration of violence avoided, but an expression of joy at justice served. Jonas stood on his porch with Samuel beside him, both of them watching the departure of the men who had threatened to tear apart the family they had created. The boy looked up at his adoptive father with eyes that held gratitude, love, and the kind of security that came from knowing he was truly protected by people who cared about his welfare. "Are they really gone, Pa?" Samuel asked quietly. "They're gone, son," Jonas replied with absolute conviction. "And they won't be back. We got too many friends watching out for us now." As the crowd began to disperse, many of the families stopped to introduce themselves to Samuel and to assure both him and Jonas that they would always be welcome in their communities. The boy who had arrived as a frightened refugee was now part of an extended family that stretched across the entire territory, connected by bonds of mutual support and shared values that transcended racial, ethnic, and religious differences. The events at Jonas's ranch had created something new in the Texas territory, a network of families and communities united by their commitment to protecting the vulnerable and standing against corruption and abuse of power. Samuel Yazzie had found not just a father in Jonas McAllister, but an entire people who had claimed him as their own and would ensure that he grew up safe, loved, and free from the kind of institutional persecution that had driven him to seek sanctuary in the first place. Years later, when Samuel had grown to manhood and started his own family, he would tell his children about the night when hundreds of torches had surrounded their grandfather's ranch, and how an entire community had chosen to stand together in defense of a frightened child who had nowhere else to turn. It was a story that would be passed down through generations, a reminder that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they chose to use it in service of what was right and just and true. The loner rancher who had refused a hand over an orphan had discovered that he was never truly alone, and the community that had rallied his cause had learned that their shared values were stronger than any force that corrupt authorities could bring against them.